The Fall of the House of Usher by Edgar Allan Poe, complete audiobook. During an entire dark, silent autumn day in which the clouds hung oppressively low in the sky, he had traveled alone, on horseback, along a monotonous road in the region, and finally, when the evening was already filled with shadows, I came into view of the melancholy house of Usher. I don't know why. As soon as I saw the building, an unbearable sadness came over me. I say unbearable because it did not relieve her of that semi-pleasant poetic feeling with which the spirit receives even the most severe images of the desolate and terrible of nature. I looked at the scene before me, the house itself and the simple landscape features of the property, the cold walls, the empty-looking windows, a few clumps of vulgar sedge and a few whitish trees with rotting trunks, with such a depression of soul. Total that I cannot compare it to any earthly sensation with more propriety than that of coming out of the opium dream, to the bitter return to daily monotony, to the fall, frightening veil. It was a coldness, a despondency, a distress, an inconsolable sadness of thought that no spur of the imagination was capable of propelling towards anything sublime. What was it, I stopped to think, that oppressed me in this way in contemplating the House of Usher? It was an insoluble mystery. I also couldn't make sense of the misty fantasies that came to me while I was meditating. I was forced to resort to the unsatisfactory conclusion that, just as there are unquestionably combinations of very simple natural objects capable of affecting us in this way, yet the analysis of such a capacity depends on factors that are beyond our reach. It is possible, I thought, that the mere different arrangement of the elements of a landscape, of the details of a painting, is enough to modify or perhaps annul their power to cause a painful sensation. And carried away by this idea, I stopped my horse at the abrupt edge of the small lake, black and gloomy, which extended its smooth luster next to the dwelling, and I stood contemplating in it, but more affected than before, the remodeled and inverted image of the gray sedges, stunted trunks, and empty-looking windows. However, in this mansion of melancholy, I now proposed to reside for a few weeks. Roderick Usher, its owner, and I had been good companions in childhood, although many years had passed since we had last seen each other. But recently, a letter had reached me in a remote corner of the region, a letter from him, which, given its urgency, admitted no other response than to go. The lyrics showed altered nerves. Its author spoke of an acute physical prostration, of a mental disorder that overwhelmed him, and of an enormous desire to see me, as the best and only friend he really had, in order to find in the solace of my company some relief to his evil. It was the way of exposing all this, and much more, the soul he put into his request, that left no room for hesitation. So I went without delay to that call which, however, seemed most unique to me. Although we had been close friends as children, I actually knew little about him. He had always been extremely reserved. He knew, it is true, that his ancient family had stood out from time immemorial for a great sensitivity, which over the generations was translated into a multitude of excellent works of art, and in recent times was manifested in repeated acts of generous but discreet altruism, as well as in a passionate devotion to the complicated fruits, more perhaps than to its orthodox and more easily recognizable beauties, of musical science. He also knew the singular fact that the trunk of the Usher line, venerable as it was, had never produced lasting branches. In other words, the entire family was extended by a direct line of descent and, except for brief and insignificant variations, it had always been that way. It was this lack, I reflected, remembering the absolute concomitance between the character of a building and the recognized character of whoever built it. In habits, while thinking about the possible influence that one could have exerted over a long period of centuries on the other, was this lack, perhaps, of collateral branches and the consequent direct transmission, from father to son, of the estate and the surname, which had finally identified the two, so that the original title of the property was absorbed into the strange and misleading name of Usher House, a name that included, in the minds of the peasants who used it, the family and the family mansion. I have said that the only effect of my childish experiment, that of looking out over the lake, was to reinforce my first impression. There is no doubt that realizing the rapid growth of my superstition, why not call it that, only increased it. Such is, I have long known, the paradoxical law of feelings that are based on terror. And perhaps it was only this reason, when I looked up from the image reflected in the water to the house, that made my brain conceive a fantasy, a ridiculous fantasy, no doubt, which I only mention to underline the intensity of the sensations that oppressed me. I had strained my imagination so much that I thought that an atmosphere reigned over the mansion and the property specifically from them and from the immediate surroundings, an atmosphere that had nothing to do with the air and the sky, but rather came from the rotten trees and the wall, gray, and from this silent mountain lake, a mystical and pestilent vapor, dull, lazy, barely discernible and leaden. Dismissing from my spirit what must have been nothing more than a dream, I observed more closely the real appearance of the building. Its outstanding feature was its extreme antiquity. The discoloration of the centuries had been great. Tiny mushrooms spread all over its exterior and hung in a fine tangle from the eaves. However, it was far from looking dilapidated. No part of the masonry had collapsed, and there was a surprising paradox between the perfect interlocking of the parts and the degree of disintegration of the ashlars. It reminded me quite a bit of a beautiful piece of cabinetry that had been rotting over the years in an abandoned crypt, undisturbed by the slightest breath of outside air. Aside from this sign of general deterioration, however, the factory showed few signs of instability. Perhaps the eye of an attentive observer could have discovered a barely perceptible crack that started from the roof and ran down the façade. Zigzag, until getting lost in the leaden waters of the lake. On one of the stairs, I ran into the family doctor. His countenance, I thought, reflected an expression that was paying attention to these things. I advanced along a short, elevated path to the house. A servant took charge of my horse, and I passed through the Gothic arch of the hall. From there, a valet, stealthily passing, led me in silence, through a multitude of intricate and dark corridors, to his master's study. Much of what I discovered along the way contributed, I don't know why, to reinforcing the vague sensation to which I have referred. Although the objects in my environment, the ceiling friezes, the dark tapestries on the walls, the ebony black floors, and the ghostly heraldic trophies that clattered with my footsteps, were details that, or like, I had been accustomed in childhood. Although I did not hesitate to admit how familiar everything was to me, I was nevertheless amazed by the strangeness of the fantasies that such normal images aroused in me, a mixture of underhanded cunning and perplexity. He greeted me flustered without stopping. The servant then threw open a door and led me into the presence of his master. The room I was in was spacious and had a very high ceiling. The windows were tall, narrow, and pointed, and so far from the black oak floor that they were completely inaccessible from the inside. Faint rays of reddish light made their way through its leaded lenses and allowed nearby objects to be distinguished. The eye, however, struggled in vain to reach the corners at the back of the chamber or the recesses of the vaulted and coffered ceiling. The general furniture was profuse, uncomfortable, old, and tattered. There were a multitude of books and musical instruments scattered, but they could not communicate animation to the scene. I felt that I was breathing in an atmosphere of sadness. An atmosphere of severe, deep, hopeless discouragement permeated everything. Upon entering, Usher got up from the sofa where he was lying and greeted me with an effusive warmth that I immediately thought had a lot of exaggerated cordiality, the obligatory effort of the ennuyé man of the world. One glance at his countenance, however, convinced me of his complete sincerity. We sat down, and for a few moments, during which he was silent, I looked at him with a feeling half of pity, half of fear. Never had a man changed so terribly in so short a space as Roderick Usher. It was difficult for me to admit that the haggard being in front of me was the companion of my early adolescence. Although the features of his face remained just as pronounced, a cadaverous skin color, large, clear, incomparably luminous eyes, lips that were somewhat thin and very pale but with an inexpressibly beautiful curve, a nose of delicate Hebrew type but with a width of nostrils unusual in such configurations, a finely molded chin that denoted, in its lack of prominence, lack of moral energy, hair of a fineness and softness more than that of a spider's web. These features, with an exaggerated widening of the temples, made up a face that was not easy to forget, and now there was such a change in the mere exaggeration of these traits, and in the expression they were wont to convey, that I doubted to whom I spoke. The spectral pallor of the skin and the now portentous brightness of the eyes, above everything else, alarmed and even frightened me. She had also let her silky hair grow completely carelessly, and since its cobweb and wild texture, rather than falling, floated around his face, it was impossible for me, even as I tried, to relate his arabesque expression with the simple idea of humanity. I was immediately surprised in my friend's attitude by an incoherence, an inconsistency, and I soon discovered that it came from a series of weak and fruitless efforts to repress a continuous trembling, a manifest nervous agitation. I was prepared for something like this, both from his letter and from the memory of certain features of his childhood, and from what I had inferred from his peculiar physical constitution and temperament. His attitude was alternately lively and grim. His voice changed rapidly from an indecisive babbling, when his energy seemed to be suspended, to that kind of vehement concision, to that gruff, slow, cavernous vocalization, to that guttural, heavy, perfectly modulated language that we observe in accomplished alcoholics and in incorrigible opium addicts in their moments of most intense agitation. Thus he spoke of the purpose of my visit, of his enormous desire to see me, and of the consolation he hoped my company would provide him. He referred at some length to what he thought was the nature of his illness. It was, he said, a physical and family ailment for which he did not expect to find a remedy, a mere nervous condition, he hastened to add, that would undoubtedly soon pass. It manifested itself in a host of abnormal sensations. Some of these, which he detailed to me, interested and puzzled me, although perhaps the words he used and the general tone with which he explained it had a lot to do with it. He suffered from a morbid acuity of the senses. He tolerated only the most tasteless foods. I could only wear clothes made of a certain kind of fabric. The smell of the flowers choked him. The dimmest light tortured his eyesight, and there were very few special sounds, and those of stringed instruments, that did not inspire him with horror. I found him obsessively enslaved to an anomalous species of terror. "I will die," he said. "I will end up dying in the midst of this lamentable madness. Thus I will end, and in no other way. I am terrified of future events, not for their own sake, but for their consequences. I tremble at the thought that any incident, even the most trivial, could influence this unbearable disturbance of the soul. In reality, I do not hate danger, but rather its absolute effect, terror. In this state of despondency, of weakness, I sense that sooner or later the time will come when I must abandon sanity and life in struggle with the terrible ghost, fear." I also realized, through ambiguous and broken hints that he made from time to time, of another singular aspect of his mental state. He was chained by certain superstitious impressions in relation to the dwelling he inhabited, and which, for years, had not been visited. Daring to abandon, in relation to an influence whose supposed strength he spoke of in terms too dark to repeat, to an influence that certain peculiarities of the form and substance of his family mansion, by dint of long suffering, he said, had ended up exerting on his spirit, to an effect that the physicality of the gray walls and towers and the dark lake over which they overlooked had finally managed to obtain on the moral part of his existence. He admitted, however, although with hesitation, that much of the singular dejection that thus afflicted him could be due to a more natural and obvious cause, the long and advanced illness and imminent fatal outcome of a sister whom he loved tenderly, only companion for many years, and last and only member of the family he had left in the world. His death, he said with a bitterness that I will never forget, would make me so fragile and hopeless, the last of the ancient Usher line. As I spoke, Lady Madeline, that was her name, passed slowly along the back of the room without noticing my presence and disappeared. I watched her with total astonishment, not without fear, and unable, however, to explain such an impression to myself. A kind of stupor dominated me, while my eyes followed her retreating steps. When the door finally closed behind her, my gaze instinctively and anxiously searched for her brother's countenance. But he had hidden the face in her hands, and I only saw that an extreme pallor had spread over her emaciated fingers, through which passionate tears were slipping. Lady Madeline's ailment had long frustrated the expertise of doctors. A persistent apathy, a gradual wasting away of his person, and frequent but transitory fits of a cataleptic type were the unusual diagnosis. Until now, he had firmly resisted the attacks of the disease without allowing himself to be confined to bed. But at the end of the day of my arrival at the house, he surrendered, as his brother told me at night with unspeakable anguish, to the prostrating power of the destroyer. And I understood that the vision I had had of her was probably going to be the last, that I would not see the lady again, alive at least. Several days passed without Usher or I mentioning his name, and during that time I dedicated myself to making every effort to alleviate my friend's melancholy. We painted and read together, or I listened to him, as if in a dream, torn improvisations with his eloquent guitar. And as our growing intimacy allowed me more unreserved access to the recesses of her spirit, the more bitterly I realized the futility of any attempt to animate a mind that shed blackness, as if by an innate and fecund gift on all objects of the moral and physical universe in an incessant irradiation of sadness. I will always cherish the memory of the solemn hours I spent with the lord of the house of Usher, but it would be useless for me to try to give an exact idea of the studies and occupations in which he involved me or initiated me. An exalted and intemperate ideality projected a sulphuric luster over everything. His long and improvised dirges will always resonate in my ears. Among other things, I keep painfully present a certain singular perversion and extension of the passionate motif of von Weber's Last Waltz, of the canvases on which he expressed his complicated fantasy, and they were becoming, brushstroke by brushstroke, a vagueness that shook me, all the more so because I didn't know why. Of those canvases, it would be useless for me to try to convey, although I still have their images vividly before me, anything more than the little that a few written words can contain. Because of their total simplicity, because of the sharpness of their drawing, they attracted and subjugated. If there has been a mortal capable of painting an idea, it was Roderick Usher. For me, at least, given the circumstances that surrounded me at the time, a dread of unbearable intensity emanated from the pure abstractions that the hypochondriac projected onto the canvas, such as I have never even remotely felt when contemplating Fuseli's intense but all too concrete lucubrations. One of my friend's phantasmagoric conceptions, which did not participate so rigidly in the spirit of abstraction, I can sketch in words, although briefly. It was a small painting that represented the interior of a basement or tunnel, immensely long and rectangular, with low, smooth, white walls and without openings or interruptions. Certain complementary details of the composition suggested that it was located enormously deep beneath the surface of the earth. No access was visible in any part of its vast expanse, nor was any torch or other artificial source of light discernible. However, a beam of intense rays crossed it that gave it a splendor inappropriate and spectral. I have just alluded to the morbid state of Usher's auditory nerve, due to which all kinds of music were unbearable for him, except for certain qualities of stringed instruments. It was the narrow limits to which he had confined himself with the guitar, perhaps, that largely gave a fantastic character to his performances. But it did not explain the fervent ease of his impromptus. The explanation must have been, and was, in the notes, as well as in the words of his extravagant fantasies, because it was often accompanied by rhymed verbal improvisations, the result of that deep concentration and inner recollection to which I have referred, and which can be observed only at times of highest artificial excitement. I remember the lyrics of one of those rhapsodies. I was perhaps most especially impressed when I heard him sing it, because in the substratum or mystical current of its meaning, I seemed to perceive in Usher, for the first time, a full awareness of the instability of his high intelligence on his throne. The verses, which he titled The Enchanted Palace, read, very approximately, if not literally, I remember that the suggestions to which this ballad gave rise embarked us on a series of considerations in which Usher expressed an opinion that I mention not so much for his originality, other men have thought this way, and for the firmness with which he maintained it. Basically, this opinion was that of the sensitivity of vegetables, but in his disturbed fantasy, such an idea had acquired an even more daring character and reached, under certain conditions, the realm of the inorganic. I lack the words to express all his dedication or serious abandonment to this conviction. Such a belief, however, affected, as I have said, the gray stones of his ancestors' home. The conditions that made this sensitivity possible were met here, I imagined, in the method of placing said stones, in the order in which they were arranged, as well as in the colonies of fungi that covered them, and in the rotten trees around them, and above all, in the long, undisturbed survival of this provision, and in its duplication in the still waters of the lake. His proof, the proof of that sensitivity, had to be seen, he said, and here he stood up as he spoke, in the gradual, although dubious condensation of an atmosphere of his own around the waters and the walls. The result could be discovered, he added, in that quiet but persistent and terrible influence that for centuries had shaped the destinies of his family, and had made him as he saw him, as he was. Opinions like this do not need comment, and I am not going to make any. Our books, the books which for years had constituted no small part of the intellectual life of the sick man, were, as may be supposed, in strict consonance with this kind of illusion. We immersed ourselves in works such as Gresset's Ververs et Chartreuse, Machiavelli's Belphegor, Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell, Holberg's Niels Klim's Journey to the Underworld, Robert Flood's Palmistry, Jean d'Indaginé and de la Chambre, Tieck's Journey to the Blue Distance, and Campanella's The City of the Sun. Our favorite book was a small recto edition called Directorium Inquisitorum by the Dominican Eymerich of Girona, and there were passages in Pomponius Mela about the ancient African satyrs and Egyptians, about which Usher dreamed for hours. His main delight, however, was in the slow reading of an extremely rare and curious Gothic volume, in quarto, Manual of a Forgotten Church, the Vigilia Mortuorum, Coram Ecclesiae Maguntinae. I could not stop thinking about the extravagant ritual of this work and its probable influence on the hypochondriac, when one night, after abruptly informing me that Lady Madeline had died, he informed me of his intention to preserve her body for 15 days, until its definitive burial, in one of the building's numerous interior basements. The mundane reason, however, that he alleged for such an unusual measure was one that I did not consider myself at liberty to discuss. His status as a brother had led him to this resolution, so he told me, due to the exceptional nature of the deceased's illness, certain anxious and inconvenient questions from the doctors, and the exposure and distance from the family cemetery. I will not deny that, when I remembered the sinister face of the man I had passed on the stairs the day I arrived at the house, I lost the desire to object to what I considered a precaution that was in any case harmless and of no extravagant way. I assisted Usher at his request in making arrangements for his temporary burial. Once the body was placed in its coffin, the two of us carried it to its resting place. The crypt in which we deposited it, and which had been unopened for so long that our torches, half smothered by the stagnant atmosphere, gave us little opportunity to inspect, was small, damp, and completely lacking in openings that would allow the entry of no light. It was very deep, directly below the part of the building where my bedroom was. Apparently, it had been used in remote feudal times for the worst purposes of a dungeon, and later as a store for gunpowder or some highly flammable material, given that part of its floor and the entire long vaulted passage through which we reached her were conveniently lined with copper. The door, all made of iron, was protected in the same way. Its enormous weight produced a most screeching noise. Unpleasant when rotating on its hinges, after depositing our gloomy burden on trestles in this region of horror, we partially removed the lid of the coffin, still unscrewed, and looked at the face of its occupant. The first thing that caught my attention was the striking resemblance between the two brothers, and Usher, perhaps guessing my thoughts, murmured some words by which I learned that the deceased and he were twins. and that between them there had always existed a communion of feelings difficult to explain. Our gazes, however, did not linger long on the deceased, since we could not contemplate her without awe. The illness that had thus sent her to the grave at the zenith of her youth had left, as usually happens in all pathologies of a strictly cataleptic nature, an imitation of a faint blush on the chest and face, and that trace of a suspiciously morose smile on the lips, which is so terrible in death. We replaced the cover and screwed it on, and once the iron door was firmly closed, we began our sorrowful return to the slightly less gloomy chambers in the upper part of the house. And then, after a few days of deep affliction, a change in the peculiarities of my friend's mental disorder became perceptible. His usual attitude was gone. He had abandoned or forgotten his usual activities. He walked from chamber to chamber with a dazed, irregular, and aimless pace. The pallor of his countenance had acquired, if possible, a still more cadaverous tone, but his eyes had completely lost their luminosity. The hoarse accent that came out from time to time before was no longer heard, and his voice had acquired a trembling stutter, as if from extreme terror. There were times, to tell the truth, when it seemed that his permanently agitated mind was suffering from the weight of some secret, and that he was struggling to find enough courage to express it. Sometimes I had no choice but to consider it extravagances typical of his derangement, because I saw him remain with his gaze fixed, lost for hours, in an attitude of the deepest attention, as if I was listening to some imaginary noise. It is not surprising that his condition terrified me, that it rubbed off on me. I felt that the senseless influence of their fantastic but powerful superstitions was slowly and covertly invading me. But my efforts were fruitless. An irrepressible tremor took over my body, and finally, a veritable incubus of unmotivated alarm sat over my heart. Shaking it off with an exhale and a heave, I sat up on the pillows and scrutinizing the of such feelings. Sleep was slow to visit my bed while the hours passed one after another. I tried to dissipate with reasoning the nervousness that dominated me. I tried to convince myself that much, if not all, of what I was feeling was due to the disturbing influence of the dark furniture of the room, of the dark, threadbare hangings that, tossed by the gusts of a gathering storm, fluttered. They moved spasmodically back and forth on the walls and whispered restlessly about the decorations on the bed. Deep darkness of the chamber, I paid attention, I don't know why, unless it was due to something instinctive, to certain low, indefinite noises that came to me at long intervals during the pauses of the storm, I didn't know from where. Dominated by an intense feeling of unbearable horror, for which I could not find an explanation, I dressed hastily, because I realized that I was not going to fall asleep tonight, and tried to get out of the pitiful state in which I was immersed by walking quickly through the room. I had made a few turns in this manner when light footsteps on the nearby staircase attracted my attention. I immediately recognized Usher's. A moment later he knocked softly with his knuckles and entered with a lamp. His face, as usual, was pale as a corpse, but also there was a kind of vasanic hilarity in his eyes, a clearly repressed hysteria in his manner. His appearance terrified me, but anything was preferable to the loneliness I had been enduring. I even welcomed its appearance with relief. "You have not seen him?" she said suddenly, after looking at him for a few moments in silence. "You haven't seen it then? Well, it doesn't matter. Now you'll see." And as he said this, shielding the flame with his hand, he ran to a window and opened it wide to the storm. The impetuous fury of the wind as it entered almost lifted us from the ground. It was indeed a night of unleashed storm, but severely beautiful and savagely singular in its beauty and its terror. A whirlwind seemed to have concentrated its force in our vicinity, because the wind underwent frequent and violent changes of direction, and the dense thickness of the clouds, so low that they weighed on the turrets of the house, did not prevent us from observing the almost deliberate speed at which they ran against each other from all points, instead of getting lost in the distance. As I say, its dense thickness did not prevent us from observing this. However, there was not the slightest glimpse of the moon or stars, nor were there lightning bolts or gunshots, but the underside of these immense masses of agitated vapor, as well as the terrestrial objects in our immediate surroundings, glowed with a faint and unnatural incandescence, with the light of a gaseous exhalation clearly visible floating and enveloping the mansion. "You shouldn't... Don't look at that!" I said to Usher with a shudder as I led him with gentle energy from the window to an armchair. "Those appearances that confuse you are mere very common electrical phenomena, or perhaps they have their spectral origin in the putrid miasmas of that lake. Let's close the window." The air is cold and dangerous for your constitution. Here is one of your favorite novels. I will read, and you will listen. And we will spend this terrible night together." The old volume he had picked up was Sir Launcelot Canning's Mad Tryst, but I had called it Usher's favorite, more as a clumsy joke than in earnest. For truly, there is little in its cumbersome prolixity that could interest my friend's high and spiritual sense of beauty. But it was the only book at hand, and I allowed myself to entertain the vague hope that the excitement that was now agitating the hypochondriac would find relief. The history of mental illness is full of singular anomalies, even in the extreme nonsense I was going to read to him. And to tell the truth, if I had judged by the deep interest with which he was, or seemed to be, paying attention to the reading of the story, I would have been able to congratulate myself on the correctness of my decision. He had reached that well-known part of the story in which Ethelred, the hero of the tryst, after trying to peacefully enter the hermit's dwelling without success, decides to do so by force. Here, the passage from the story, as will be remembered, runs like this: "And Ethelred, who was fearless at heart, and felt strong because of the powerful wine he had drunk, waited no longer to parley with the hermit, who was truly of stubborn and malevolent genius, but feeling the rain on his shoulders and fearing that the storm would get worse, he raised his mace and, with a few blows, opened a gap in the boards of the door to insert his gloved hand. And now, pulling it hard, he split it, dislocated it, and made it splinter, so that the dull, cavernous noise of the wood reverberated and alarmed the entire forest." At the end of the paragraph, I was startled and remained silent for a moment, because it seemed to me, although I immediately concluded that my overexcited imagination had deceived me, it seemed to me that from some remote part of the mansion, I had received, indistinctly, what could have been, it has been, by its exact similarity, the echo, but muffled, of the creaking and splitting that Sir Launcelot described in such detail. It was, without the slightest doubt, mere coincidence that had caught my attention, because amid the clattering of the window frames and the normal tumult of thunder from the still-growing storm, said noise had in itself, nothing that should surprise or worry me. I continued reading. "But the good paladin Ethelred, now crossing the door, was greatly surprised and enraged to discover not the slightest trace of the malevolent hermit, but, in his place, a scaly dragon of portentous presence, endowed with a tongue of fire, which he stood guard before a palace of gold, with a floor of silver, and on the wall hung a shining bronze shield with this legend inscribed: 'Whoever enters here has been a victor. Whoever kills the dragon will have won the shield.' And Ethelred raised his mace, and brought it down upon the head of the dragon, which fell before him, and breathed his last stinking breath with a shrill, horrendous, and piercing screech that Ethelred had to cover his ears with his hands at such a horrible sound. Death rattle, like no other like it ever heard." Here I interrupted my reading again, now with a feeling of absolute stupor, because I had no doubt this time that I had heard, although it was impossible for me to determine from what place it came, a low screech or screech, apparently distant, but long, shrill, and most unusual, an exact replica of the dragon's screech that my imagination had evoked according to the novelist's description. Overwhelmed, as I certainly felt by this second and most strange coincidence, by 1,000 contradictory emotions in which extreme astonishment and terror prevailed, I nevertheless preserved sufficient presence of mind to refrain from exciting, with any comment, the fine sensibility of my partner. He wasn't at all sure that he had heard the squeak in question, although it was evident that his manner had undergone a strange change in the last few minutes. From sitting in front of me, he had gradually turned his chair, so that now I could only partially see his face, although I noticed that his lips were trembling, as if he were murmuring something inaudible. His head was drooping on his chest, but I knew he was not asleep, since his eye was rigidly open, as I saw him in profile. The movement of his body, too, belied such an idea, since he rocked from one side to the other with a soft, although forced and uniform sway. After quickly observing all this, I resumed Sir Launcelot's story, which continued, "And then the paladin, who had escaped the terrible fury of the dragon, remembering the bronze shield, and that the enchantment that weighed upon it had been broken, pushed the corpse out of his way, and advanced bravely along the pavement of silver from the castle, towards where the shield was on the wall, which certainly did not wait for him to reach him, but fell at his feet on the silver floor with a terrible and vibrant crash. And then the paladin, who had escaped the terrible fury of the dragon, remembering the bronze shield, and that the enchantment that weighed upon it had been broken, pushed the corpse out of his way, and advanced bravely along the silver pavement of the castle towards where the shield was on the wall, which certainly did not wait for him to reach him, but fell at his feet on the silver floor with a terrible and vibrant crash. No sooner had these words left my lips than I heard, as if a bronze shield had really fallen at that moment heavily on a silver floor, a clear, hollow, metallic, and thunderous, although clouded resonance. With my nerves on edge, I jumped up. On the other hand, Usher continued without altering his rhythmic swing. I ran to the seat where I was. He was staring straight ahead, and his entire attitude had taken on a stony rigidity. But when I put a hand on his shoulder, his body shuddered. A languid smile trembled on his lips, and I observed that he was saying something in a low, hurried murmur, as if unaware of my presence. Leaning towards him, I finally swallowed the awful meaning of his words. "Don't you hear it? I do hear it, and I have heard it. Many minutes, many hours, many days I have heard it, although I did not dare to speak. Ah, have mercy on me, on this poor wretch. I didn't dare to speak. We have placed her alive in the tomb. Didn't I tell you my senses were keen? Now I tell you that I heard his first faint movements in the hole of the coffin. I heard them many days ago, although I didn't dare to speak. And now, tonight, Ethelred, ha, his smashing of the hermit's door, and the agonized scream of the dragon, and the crash of the shield, or rather the smashing of the coffin, the creaking of the iron hinges of his prison, his struggles at the door of the crypt. Ah, where to run? Won't you show up here in a moment? Aren't you coming to reproach me for my haste? Didn't I hear your footsteps on the stairs? Do I not clearly distinguish the violent and horrible beating of his heart? Crazy. Here he jumped up furiously and shouted the syllables as if expelling his soul in the effort. Madman! I'm telling you, he's in front of the door right now, as if he had found in the superhuman energy of his tone the power of a spell. The enormous ancient blades he pointed to slowly opened their heavy ebony jaws outward. It was the work of the wind, but there, on the other side of those doors, was the tall, shrouded figure of Lady Madeline of Usher. There was blood on his white garment, and signs of a frantic struggle on every portion of his emaciated person. For a moment he stood trembling and hesitating on the threshold. Then, with a long, muffled groan, he fell heavily inward onto his brother's body, and in the midst of a violent and now mortal agony, he knocked him to the ground as a corpse, a victim of the terrors that he himself had predicted. I fled in horror from that chamber and from that mansion. The storm continued to unleash its wrath as it crossed the old road. Suddenly, an intense light illuminated the path, and I turned to see where such an extraordinary glow came from, since behind me there was only the enormous house with its shadows. It came from the moon, full setting, blood red, which now crossed the barely discernible crack that, as I said before, tore the building in a zigzag pattern from the roof to the base. As he watched, the crack widened rapidly. A furious gust burst forth from the whirlwind. The entire globe of the satellite burst into view before me, and my brain spun as I saw the imposing walls collapsing on one side and the other. A long, tumultuous scream sounded like the voice of 1,000 waters, and the deep and unhealthy lake at my feet closed grimly in silence over the ruins of the House of Usher. End of the fall of the Usher House.